everyone, I'm Ashley at the Silver Bay Public Library, and I am back once again with a read aloud for you guys. If you remember last time, we began our book, A Single Shard by Linda Sue Park. We read chapters 1 and 2, so if you haven't already heard those chapters or read them on your own, make sure to go check out our last video. And yeah, so we're going to start on chapter 3. These don't have chapter names, so we're just going to dive right in. Let us begin, I guess. Tree Ear trotted up the road toward Min's house, but he slowed a little when he heard the potter scolding him before he even arrived. What kind of useless boy was he, coming back so late the day before and leaving the cart without a word? That wood should have been taken to the kiln and unloaded. Min had done it himself at dusk and had nearly injured himself stumbling home in the darkness. Such help was worse than no help at all. Now, did Tree Ear really intend to make himself useful? If not, it would be better for him to forget their whole arrangement. Finally, Min paused to draw breath. Tree Ear dared not look up. He felt like a beast with two heads, one ashamed, the other resentful. Ashamed that he had not finished the work properly, resentful that Min had not given him complete instructions. Fill the cart, that had been the order, and he had done it. Was he expected to read Min's mind as well? But the shame won out in Tree Ear. He feared being sent away before he could learn to make a pot. I am sorry that I displeased the honorable potter, Tree Ear said. If you would be so good as to give me another chance, you will not be disappointed. Humph. Min turned and walked toward the side of the house. Tree Ear stood still for a moment, unsure of what to do. Well, Min turned back impatiently. Are you coming, beggar boy, or are you a statue with your feet frozen to the ground? Tree Ear's joy at being forgiven was like a wisp of smoke. Min's orders for the day blew it into nothingness. His task was the same as the previous days, to fill the cart with wood and this time unload it at the kiln site. Each day, Tree Ear appeared at Min's door eagerly. Each day, Min sent him up the mountain with a cart to chop more wood. At night, with Crane Man's careful ministrations, the wound on Tree Ear's hand would begin to heal, the tender pink layer toughening slightly, but at the start of the next day's work it would split and bleed again. Tree Ear came to expect the pain. The throbbing was like an unwelcome companion who appeared daily after the first few strokes of the axe. On the third day, Crane Man had offered to come with him. Tree Ear's mind raced to think of a polite refusal. He knew that what would happen. Crane Man would want to spare Tree Ear's blistered hand and would take up the axe himself. Tree Ear shuddered, picturing Crane Man trying to chop wood while leaning on his crutch. He might well injure his good leg. Your offer to help is kindness itself, Tree Ear answered. But it is all the same to you. It is far better for me to return to a meal already prepared. I could not imagine greater assistance than this. Crane Man was satisfied. It seemed to Tree Ear that his friend spent the entire day figuring out how to transform a handful of weeds and bones into something that resembled a meal. Over the days, Tree Ear developed a routine of work and rest, a period of diligent chopping and loading, then a break. This was better than several hours of frenzied chopping that left him with a vast, untidy pile of wood, which took much time to load and left him exhausted. In the brief periods of rest, he was sometimes able to gather a little food, a few wild mushrooms here, a handful of fern sprouts there. Crane Man had taught him well on their many walks through these mountains together. Tree Ear knew which mushrooms were tasty and which deadly. He knew the birds by their songs, and how a mountain lion's spoor looked different from that of a deer. And he never lost his way, for he knew what the streams ran. For he knew where the streams ran, pointing sure as an arrow back down the mountain toward the road. Besides his quiet times reading the mountain, Tree Ear's favorite part of the day was unloading the wood at the kiln site. The kiln was located at the far end of the village from Min's house. Nearby was a large, roughly built shed. Tree Ear wheeled the cart to the shed's entry, then carried armfuls of wood inside where it would stay dry. The wood was stacked as high as a man could reach in orderly piles on either side of a central aisle. Tree Ear liked arranging his wood neatly so the potters could take what they needed without the whole of the stack collapsing. At the kiln site, he often saw potters whose turn it was to use the kiln. They would greet him with a nod when he arrived. On the fourth day, one of them spoke to him. You are Min's new boy, are you not? Tree Ear knew the potter who spoke. His name was King. He was old enough for Gray to streak his hair, but younger than Min, with a keen eye and restless manner. Tree Ear lowered the handle of the cart to the ground and bowed his head. High time the old man got himself some help, Kang spoke with what seemed like an edge to his voice. The last few times he did not bring anywhere near his proper share of wood. Then Kang stepped forward and began to help unload the cart. so Tree Ear's work was finished earlier than usual. He was left with time enough to rifle through a rubbish dump on his way home. The cabbage core that he found would add to Crane Man's culinary efforts for dinner. It was the morning of the 10th day. The evening before, Tree Ear had returned the cart to its usual spot next to Min's house, and had lingered about for a few moments. But Min did not emerge from the house, so Tree Ear had departed at last, his debt of work paid in full. Awake for most of the night, Tree Ear had considered over and over how best to approach Min. In the 9 days of work, Tree Ear had not once touched clay. He would never be able to make a pot unless he continued his relationship with the potter. Tree Ear rehearsed his words one last time as he neared Min's house. He drew in a breath and held it for a moment to steady himself. Then he called out, "Master Potter." To Tree Ear's surprise, Min's wife opened the door. He knew, of course, that Min was married. On the days that he had spied on Min, Tree Ear had occasionally glimpsed the wife coming out to the yard to scatter grain for the chickens or to fetch the water. But because she had nothing to do with the pottery work, Tree Ear had ignored her, and in the past several days of wood-cutting he had not seen or thought of her at all. Now he bowed his head as he stood before her. "Is the master home?" he asked. "He is at breakfast," she answered. "You may wait at the back of the house." Tree Ear nodded his thanks and stepped away, but the woman spoke again quietly. "A good thing you're chopping the wood. He is not as young as he once was." Her voice trailed off. Tree Ear glanced up at her and their eyes met. Hers were bright and soft, set in a small face netted with fine wrinkles, and soft, set in a small... He dropped his gaze at once, not wishing to be considered impolite. Like Crane Man's eyes, he thought, and wondered why. Min was washing his hands in a basin under the eaves when Tree Ear reached the backyard. "What are you doing here?" Min's voice was cross, and he did not look up. "It has been 9 days, and your debt is discharged. If you came to hear me say it, you can go now." Tree Ear bowed. "I beg the Honorable Potter to pardon my insolence," he said. "I wish to express my gratitude." Yes, Min said impatiently. "What is it?" "It would be a great honor for me to continue working for the Potter," Tree Ear began the speech he had planned so carefully. "If he would consider—" "I cannot pay you." Min's interruption could hardly have been more abrupt, but the curt words swept over Tree Ear like cool rain over a parched field. "I cannot pay you" is the same as yes. A surge of joy lifted Tree Ear's heart into his throat, so that he had to cough politely before speaking again. "To work for such a master is payment enough," he murmured. "Temple bell until sundown, every day," said Min. Tree Ear found himself on the ground, collapsed in a full bow of gratitude. It was all he could do to keep himself from running all the way back to the bridge to tell Crane Man the good news. Clay today, not wood. Those were Min's orders for the 10th day. Once again, Tree Ear trundled the cart, this time along the river road, until he reached the digging area. Here, the clay had been cut away in neat slabs, leaving a pattern of staggered rectangles in the riverbank. Tree Ear paused for a moment when he reached the clay pits. He had passed by the pits many times before, and had always liked looking at the scene there. The geometric pattern of the clay bank pleased him, but today he felt as though he were seeing the men and boys working there for the first time. Using spades, they slashed at the clay with movements almost too swift to follow. When a slab of clay had been outlined with the spade, it was cut away from the bank and heaved into a nearby cart or basket. Tree Ear watched for a while, the spade Min had given him on his shoulder. Then he slid down the muddy bank to stand in the shallow water. Raising the spade high over his shoulder, he brought it down with a dull thunk. It sliced into the wet clay, and Tree Ear noted with satisfaction the clean line made by the spade's edge. He tugged at the spade's handle, ready to make his next cut. The spade didn't budge. Tree Ear frowned and pulled again. The head of the spade was well and truly buried. The Tree Ear tried using both hands down low on the handle. The clay made squelching, sucking noises as if it were trying to swallow the spade. Finally, Tree Ear was forced to claw away the clay around the spade head in order to free it. His arms and legs were already covered with mud. He paused to brush away a mosquito and rubbed a swash of mud across one side of his face. At last, he stood up and swung the spade again. It took him all morning to fill the cart with clay. The other diggers were long gone, having cut their clay with a swift skill that left Tree Ear alone and in despair. Heavy. The wet clay was far heavier than he had ever imagined. He could not begin to lift a slab with the spade. He had to cut each slab into several pieces and lift them one at a time into the cart. Tree Ear scowled to see the misshapen masses of clay in his cart, so different from the neat rectangles of the other workers. Moreover, the spade work had torn open his blistered hand again, but it was not so painful as it had been on the mountainside, for here he could apply handfuls of cooling, soothing mud to the wound. By the time the cart was loaded, Tree Ear wore mud like a second skin. Even raising his eyebrows was difficult, for his forehead was stiff and dried with clay. And he was so exhausted that he could hardly bear the thought of wheeling the now heavy cart back to Min's house. Then a sudden thought came to him. Dinner! He had forgotten in the toil of the morning. Apprentices, assistants, the lowliest workers in every trade, no matter what their status, it was the master's duty to provide a meal for them in the middle of the workday. Now the Tree Ear was no longer working off a debt, Min was obliged to feed him. The thought broke through Tree Ear's fatigue like a shaft of sunlight piercing a cloud. He had left the cart on the road and bounded into the river. He scrubbed and splashed and ducked under the water completely to get rid of as much grime as he possibly could. It would never do to appear for his first working meal dressed in mud. Min glanced briefly at the clay-filled cart. "You were long enough in returning," he said with a sniff. "I will not be able to do any more work until after my midday meal." He walked into the house, having said nothing about Tree Ear's food. But Tree Ear barely had time to wonder before Min's wife appeared in the doorway. She held out a parcel tied up in cloth. Tree Ear trotted to the door, resisting the impulse to snatch the parcel from her. He bowed his head and held out his hands, palms up together, as was proper when accepting something. Min's wife placed the cloth package in his hands. "Eat well, work well," she said. A hot lump rose in Tree Ear's throat. He raised his head and saw in her eyes that she heard his thanks even though he could not speak the words. Tree Ear sat on a stone under the paulownia tree and untied the corners of a cloth. It held a gourd bowl filled with rice, whose whiteness was accented by a few dark shreds of savory dried fish, and a little pile of kimchi, pickled cabbage, vivid with seasonings of red pepper, green onions, and garlic. A pair of chopsticks was laid neatly across the top of the bowl. Tree Ear picked up the chopsticks and stared for a moment. One of the things he was certain, the feast day banquets in the palace of the king could never better the modest meal for him, for he had earned it. Tree Ear carted another load of clay for Min that afternoon. They returned to the bridge where Crane Man had stewed some wild mushrooms for their supper. Tree Ear spoke eagerly about his work that day. It was not until Crane Man rose to gather the supper bowls that Tree Ear noticed something was missing. The crutch. Sure enough, after handing Tree Ear the bowls to wash, Crane Man sat down with his knife and a sturdy, straight branch and began to whittle a new crutch. Tree Ear wiped out the bowls, stacked them neatly on the rock shelf, and finally asked, "What happened to the old one?" Crane Man paused in his work, then waved his knife impatiently. "Stupidity happened," he answered. "There was a run of flounder today." That was all he said, but Tree Ear heard much more. Although Chuotpo was on the sea, it was a potter's village, not a fishing village. The men and boys seldom took time from their work to fish. Still, they all knew the useful skill of fishing, and the women and girls often gathered shellfish at low tide. A run of flounder meant that a school of the tasty fish had come into shore far closer than usual. The waves even tossed fish right up onto the beach. Such news sent many scrambling for their bamboo poles, but one had to be among the first to run from the village down to the shore. The flounder found their way back out to the sea soon enough, and the fish flopping about on the sand were scooped up only by the quickest. It had always been Tree Ear who skipped out to the beach at the first word of a flounder run, and he had never returned without a fat fish or two for a rare feast. Now he knew without asking that Crane Man had hobbled down to the beach and lurched about on the sand, so treacherous to his crutch, only to come away empty-handed. Crane Man shaved another curl of wood, then held the crutch up to his eye, squinting to check that its lines were true. "I was angry about not getting any fish," he said as he returned to his whittling, "so I struck my crutch against a rock. It broke, of course." A little pile of shavings had grown at Crane Man's feet. Tree Ear crouched and stirred the pile with his finger, too ashamed to look up. In his mind, he saw Crane Man making his slow, painful way back from the beach, with only a broken crutch to help him, and no fish for his trouble. How was it that in enjoying his noontime meal, Tree Ear had forgotten his friend? He should have saved some of the food for Crane Man. If it had been the other way around, Crane Man would have never forgotten. Tree Ear swept the shavings into his palms and threw them in the river. As he watched the current carry them away, he mumbled, "I'm sorry about the flounder." "Ah, friend," Crane Man said, "you must mean I am sorry about your leg, because that is the reason for our fishless supper today. But I think it is a waste for either of us to spend too much time in sorrow over something we cannot change. Crane Man grunted as he stood, then leaned on the new crutch to test it. Satisfied, he nodded at Tree Ear. Besides, when I leave this world I will have 2 good legs and no need for such as this. And he tapped the crutch with his free hand. Still cross with himself, Tree Ear grumbled half under his breath. Some of us will have 4 good legs. Crane Man batted at him with the new crutch. What are you saying, impudent boy? That I will be a beast in the next life? Tree Ear began to protest. No, not you. Then he stopped and grinned. Well, maybe, he said, putting his hand on his chin in an aptitude of deep thought. A rabbit, I think. Very clever and quick. You had better be quick now yourself, Crane Man bellowed in mock anger, brandishing the crutch, sword fashion. Tree Ear began hopping about their little den like a rabbit, dodging Crane Man's jabs and swipes, his shame forgotten for the moment, as the day ended in laughter. And that, my friends, was chapter 3. And I believe that's going to be all for us today. Just 1 chapter. Keep you wanting more, of course. But please remember, obviously we are open here at the library, so come and stop to come check out books. We have lots and lots of wonderful books for you guys to read. So don't forget. I hope you liked listening. I do this Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So stay tuned for next Wednesday. And yeah, thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful day, and bye-bye.